long before the Imperium, before the Eldar, before the Tyranids, chaos, or even the warp as we know it, there was the war in heaven. A cataclysmic conflict fought over 60 million years ago between godlike empires whose very names echo like myth. On one side, the proud and ancient Necrontyr, later reborn as the soulless Necrons. On the other, the mysterious, reality-bending Old Ones, masters of the warp and creators of countless species. This wasn't a war of borders or conquest. It was a war for the soul of the galaxy. Civilizations were extinguished, stars were shattered, entire realities were rewritten, and in its wake came everything: demons, gods, warp storms, the psychic awakening of countless races, even the seeds of chaos itself. In this episode, we'll dive into the first and possibly greatest galactic war in Warhammer history, a conflict that shaped the very fabric of reality and whose consequences are still being felt today. This is where it all began. The rise of the Necrontyr and the Old Ones. Before war consumed the stars, there were two ancient powers, the Necrontyr and the Old Ones. The Necrontyr were born beneath a cruel dying sun. Their lives were short, agonizing, and haunted by radiation sickness. Yet their ambition was limitless. Masters of science and bitter resentment, the Necrontyr built a vast stellar empire, not for glory, but to escape the pain of their own mortality. They hated the Old Ones for one reason above all. The Old Ones were immortal. The Old Ones were a race of near-divine beings, ancient beyond measure. They had mastered the webway, warp manipulation, and biological engineering. They didn't just travel the stars, they cultivated them. Their creations seeded entire ecosystems, uplifted species, and guided civilizations from the shadows. Where the Necrontyr saw a brutal, uncaring galaxy, the Old Ones saw a garden. But the Necrontyr wanted more than survival. They wanted vengeance, and they resented the Old Ones not just for their power, but for their refusal to share it. When the Old Ones rejected their request for aid, the Necrontyr turned that bitterness into war. But the Necrontyr were not yet gods. They fought with conventional weapons, starships, plasma weapons, and spite. And in those early years, they lost. The Old Ones had the webway, the warp, knowledge of the cosmos that made the Necrontyr look like children. It wasn't a war, it was a beating. But the Necrontyr would not accept defeat. In desperation, they turned to something far older, far darker, the C'tan. And with that, the war would change forever. The coming of the C'tan and the birth of the Necrons. In their desperation, the Necrontyr looked to the stars, not for inspiration, but for revenge. There, they discovered the C'tan, the star gods, primordial beings of living energy. The C'tan were drawn to the physical universe by the Necrontyr's science and hubris. The Necrontyr constructed bodies of living metal, called necrodermis, to house these entities, and in doing so, gave them form, gave them power, gave them hunger. At first, the alliance was a miracle. The C'tan taught the Necrontyr how to harness reality itself. With the C'tan's guidance, the Necrontyr unlocked the deepest secrets of matter, energy, and death. And then came the ultimate betrayal, dressed as a gift. The C'tan offered the Necrontyr immortality, not as fragile flesh, but as eternal, indestructible metal. And the Necrontyr accepted. What followed was the biotransference. Across their empire, Necrontyr minds were stripped from their bodies and bound into mechanical forms. their souls cast into the warp as screaming echoes. They had achieved immortality at the cost of everything that made them alive. They were no longer Necrontyr. They were now the Necrons. And the C'tan, well-fed and empowered, turned the Necron race into a weapon. No longer driven by fear of death, the Necrons waged war with cold godlike precision. Their fleets darkened the stars. Their weapons, Gauss flayers, celestial disruptors, black hole generators, could unmake matter, erase time, or scour the soul itself. The old ones, once unchallenged, now faced a horror beyond comprehension. And the war in heaven truly began. The fall of the old ones and the rise of chaos. The C'tan had remade the Necrontyr into perfect, unfeeling killers. But they didn't just wage war, they butchered the galaxy. Entire star systems were silenced. The Necrons no longer aged, no longer feared. They descended like gods of death, annihilating anything that resisted. And the C'tan, they feasted on suns, on life, and most terrifyingly, on souls. The old ones, so long untouchable, were suddenly hunted. Even their mastery of the warp and the webway could not stem the tide. So, they turned to the only weapons left to them: new life. Using their unmatched knowledge of genetic engineering, the old ones seeded entire races to fight the war on their behalf. Among their greatest creations were the Eldar, a psychic race gifted with powerful warp sensitivity, and the Crocs, the ancestors of the modern-day orcs, designed for brute strength and instinctive warfare. But with every new weapon, the warp deepened. Because the warp is not a tool, it's a mirror, reflecting thought, emotion, and trauma back into reality. And as war, rage, pain, and madness flooded the galaxy, the Imperium twisted. From that storm of suffering, something ancient awoke. The first Chaos Gods, Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, Slaanesh, or their protoforms, were born not as divine beings, but as echoes of collective emotion. Fear and hate gave shape to war. Deception and ambition gave shape to sorcery. Despair and decay gave birth to death itself. The warp, once a realm of psychic energy and faster-than-light travel, became corrupted, dangerous, alive. The old ones, already losing to the Necrons, now found themselves assaulted on a second front by entities they had accidentally helped create. World after world fell, C'tan fed. The old ones began to vanish. Some were hunted to extinction. Others fled into the webway, sealing the gates behind them. Their last creations, like the Eldar, would carry their legacy forward. But the old ones themselves were gone, and with their fall, the galaxy changed forever. The war in heaven was ending, but peace was never an option. The betrayal of the C'tan and the silent victory of the Necrons. The old ones were gone. The galaxy lay in ruin. The Necrons stood triumphant, immortal, unchallenged, eternal. But it wasn't their war anymore. It belonged to the C'tan, those once ethereal star gods who had used the Necrontyr's desperation to build thrones of suffering and feed on entire suns. Their hunger had reshaped the galaxy, but they had made a mistake. They thought the Necrons would remain their servants. They forgot that what they had created was not a slave race, but a revenge engine. Freed from the pain of flesh and the fear of death, the Necrons turned on their creators. In a rebellion unlike any other, the Necrons shattered the C'tan, once thought invincible, using weapons forged with the very knowledge the C'tan had given them. Some were destroyed. Others were broken into shards, imprisoned in containment fields, and bound into service as living batteries and weapons. The gods had won the war, but their tools had the last word. With their enemies gone and their creators betrayed, the Necrons now ruled a galaxy of silence and ash. But there was no victory parade, only a dead universe and a legacy soaked in betrayal. Their immortality became a curse. Their empire, now empty, began to erode. And so, the Necron dynasties made one final, clinical decision. Sleep. Across the galaxy, tomb worlds powered down. Necron lords entombed themselves with their legions, waiting for a time when the stars would grow quiet again, and the galaxy would be ready for reclamation. But in their absence, chaos spread. The Eldar rose, then fell. Humanity evolved, the galaxy changed, the Necrons waited, and now they are waking up. The war in heaven is over, but its shadows never left. The Necrons slumbered, but not forever. The Citan were shattered, but not destroyed. The old ones vanished, but their creations remain. And chaos was just getting started. Every war in the galaxy, from the Horus Heresy to the fall of the Eldar, from the rise of the Imperium to the threat of the Tyranids, is a ripple from that first ancient conflict. The war in heaven wasn't just a battle for dominance. It was the moment the galaxy learned what it meant to suffer forever. The Necrons return now not as conquerors, but as the old kings of a realm gone mad. The webway still twists beneath reality, haunted by echoes of its creators. And the warp remembers. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And this was the first. The war in heaven.